Good afternoon, everyone. This is Judith Brown-Dianis. I am Executive Director of the National Office of Advancement Projects. We wanted to thank you for joining us today for our webinar on our recently released report, Democracy Disappeared: How Florida Silences the Black Vote Through Felony Disenfranchisement. So for those who don't know Advancement Project, we are a national racial justice organization that supports grassroots movements to end structural racism. The way we do our work is that we provide what we call community lawyers. Those are lawyers who work in tandem with grassroots organizations to provide all kinds of strategy and carefully crafted legal strategies. We also provide support from communications folks. So we act as a PR firm for our partners on the ground, but also to move the national dialogue. We also have on staff strategic campaign folks who help with larger strategy for our grassroots partners. And finally, the other way that we engage is that we weave movement across the country. So we work with grassroots groups, but we bring them together to build out broader national campaigns. So this is a slide that shows many of the states that we are currently working in, where we have grassroots partners who are working in various programs that we have. We have a program around Opportunity to Learn. We have our Power and Democracy program, which is where our voting work lives. We have a Justice Project, which is where our policing and criminal justice work lives. And then we have an Immigrant Justice Project. So our Power and Democracy program has been working since the year 2000 to get rid of barriers to voting. We have two parts of that program: our voter protection program and our Right to Vote initiative. Very important to our work has been over the past several years, we have focused on the issue of rights restoration. We have worked in Virginia, where we were the organization that provided the legal memo to three governors, actually four governors, and Governor McAuliffe finally took us up on it and restored the voting rights of about 200,000 people in the state of Virginia. We have been working on that issue since 2003, and we're really excited when we finally got there with our partner, New Virginia Majority, in 2016. We also are doing work around rights restoration in Louisiana, where we are working with an organization called Vote, Voice of the Experienced, and we represent them in litigation, but also in advocacy to dismantle the structure there that prevents people on probation and parole from voting. And in Florida, we have been doing this work. We are one of the founding members of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and have been working with folks there for a number of years to find ways to eliminate the barrier, the historic barrier there to voting for people with felony convictions. Today we're going to spend time talking about the report that we just put out, Democracy Disappeared. I think really important is, why did we do this report? The report, why and what does it show? The report is important because we wanted to show that Black communities in particular have diminished political power because there are huge concentrations of returning citizens in their neighborhoods who cannot vote. And so when you have concentrations of people who can't vote, all of us suffer. And in fact, we have found in the report, it shows the relationship between these neighborhoods where returning citizens are coming back and socioeconomic factors. So as you can imagine, higher unemployment, lower educational attainment, and higher child poverty rates. And this is important because at the end of the day, if those communities don't have their voices restored, they will continue to see these kinds of factors and these kinds of outcomes in their communities, because we all know that in order to make the big change that we want to have, voting is one of the tools that we have to hold systems accountable and elected officials accountable. So it's important work. We're going to, during this webinar, go through the report. We'll also show you how the report can be used, because we do think that it's an important report for organizers on the ground right now and in this moment over the next month or so, that it can be used as a tool for organizers. But really also important are the stories that are in the report. And with that, I will hand it over to one of the people who is impacted by the law in Florida, Dexter Gunn, who is founder and director of SOARS Reset. Dexter?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dexter Gunn. I'm a 50-year-old male in the state of Florida, previously incarcerated in the Department of Corrections. I served a 20-year sentence in the Florida Department of Corrections, and upon being released in 2011, I felt the effects of not having voting rights almost immediately, because as I can see within my community that the Black community as a whole had no say-so in many of the things that were transpiring in the community. South Florida is a multicultural area, and even in the city of Miami, you can see that there are almost as many Hispanic candidates that run for office, and they're often supported by other Hispanics. So when we have the Black candidates that run for office here in the Broward area, especially in the South Florida area, Tri-County area, West Beach, Broward, and Dade area, there's lack of support. This is hard to garner support because of the fact that so many people, Black Americans have lost their voting rights, that no one can come out to actually support the candidates as needed. So therefore, through the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, we went up to seek out as many people that would be willing to participate in the upcoming elections, and we sought out returning citizens to encourage their family members and the people who can vote, that possess voters' registration cards, that would normally not turn out. And that's one of the big problems that we have. We have a low voter turnout because of lack of enthusiasm that whether or not if their vote's going to count. And so our voting power has been diminished to the point to where it coincides with the gentrification that's going on in South Florida as well, especially in the Black community in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where zoning laws are being changed, and judges are being elected to benches with almost no one coming out to vote for the elections. And these same judges are the ones that impose harsh sentences among Black defendants, have no sensitivity to Black defendants or their plight, their situations, their economic situations, or any of that. It's just almost that, it just seems that they just want Black individuals incarcerated. And the higher the incarceration rate, the higher the conviction rate, results in more Black males, Black females losing their voting rights. And this has been a problem for well over 30 years that has basically been undetected until organizations like the Advancement Project and Florida Rights Restoration Coalition brought these things to light. I mean, we know that the problem has always been there, but everyone has ignored it to the point to where it has got to be a state of emergency right now.
Great. Thank you, Dexter, for sharing that, as well as for your work in building SOARS Reset to support at-risk youth. I know that work is really important to you as well. And Dexter will be available for questions as well later on. We wanted to open with Dexter in part just because we think it is really important to center the voices of returning citizens in this work. Folks like Dexter are the ones who are most impacted, and what we're hoping is that this report will be a large part of helping to lift up their voices and to help organize in the communities that they're returning to. My name is Eileen MA. I'm one of the staff attorneys here at Advancement Project and one of the co-authors of the report. And I'm going to just run over the main components that are in the report before Rob King, who's our data analyst and the other co-author, reviews the data. First, I want to reiterate what Judith Brown-Dianis, our executive director, said, which is that the reason we did this report was to be useful on the ground and also to uplift this issue as a racial justice issue that really impacts the Black community in a disproportionate way. So in doing our research, we first sought to identify where returning citizens are returning to in order to understand what their experiences once they return, and then also to particularly look at the impact and experiences of the Black community in light of felony disenfranchisement and the large numbers of returning citizens that go back to those communities. So the report itself has three main, the report itself is developed so that it can be used by a fairly broad audience. Judy mentioned it before, but first it's really for organizers on the ground so that they can work to galvanize their communities for the ballot measure and educate their communities on this issue of rights restoration. We have already been in dialogue with the groups who have been doing this work for some time, including, of course, Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which has been a close partner of ours, New Florida Majority, SEIU, Dream Defenders, and many of the other groups in the statewide alignment group that have been heavily engaged in the efforts around the ballot measure in the last year and a half as people have been talking about the issue. We also hope policymakers will use it and look at it and consider how both the change can be implemented in the clemency process as well as some broader criminal justice reform issues, because as we know, it's not just about people's release, it's also about their experience in getting jobs, getting education, supporting their families once they return to those communities. For research, I think we think that there are many different opportunities to pursue further research on this issue. We've done one slice of it, and we hope others will take it on beyond. And then generally, I think will be interesting and useful for a broad range of advocates, allies, including funders, including other organizers who can look at different communities in a lot of different ways to consider what this means for their work. So the report itself is broken down into three main components. The first is really the context and history of felony disenfranchisement. I think it's maybe a well-told story that felony disenfranchisement is a relic of slavery, that it was one way that the Black vote was suppressed even after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so the report itself really just draws on that history and talks about how this is a continuing legacy of voter suppression that folks are experiencing in the Black community. And in truth, I think we see it as an intentional systemic regime that is keeping power held in certain places and preventing certain communities from having a say. The second part is really the personal stories. You can read the report and learn a lot more about Dexter's story, as well as several other individuals who have shared their personal paths from their incarceration up on through the amazing work that they're doing now to build their own communities. And so we think that's a centerpiece of the report. And then thirdly is the data and some analysis of that data that really shows us that returning citizens are returning primarily to, or predominantly to, Black communities. So we took a look at 10 different counties. I won't list them all, people can take a look in the report. But what it showed is that when we looked at the neighborhoods with particularly high percentages of Black population, that's where we also saw higher numbers of returning citizens. And then we matched that analysis and data with other census data that looked at socioeconomic factors, including unemployment rates, child poverty rates, median incomes, and educational attainment. And what we found is that these Black neighborhoods where returning citizens are going back to and where they're disenfranchised, those communities are facing, faring worse and facing dire socioeconomic conditions. And so with that, with that summary, I'm gonna leave it off to Rob King, who will talk about the data analysis in greater detail.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here with us. So in addition to the things that we have inside the report, we also have a web page dedicated to the report itself with additional materials and resources. So if you go there to advancementproject.org/democracy disappeared, you'll find more charts and graphs that help kind of lay out some of the things that we discussed within the report itself. One of the things that we're also excited about with the report is that we took this data that we collected, and we were able to create an interactive map with it that allows people to really go in and figure out what's going on within their communities. So a person has the opportunity to go to the search bar, type in a county, let's say Hillsborough, and then the map will kind of zoom in to that county, and it allows you to play around with the zip codes and really get a feel for the information that we present throughout the report itself. And so the darker the areas are, the redder areas tend to indicate the areas with higher numbers of returning citizens, right? And one of the really nice things is that you can zoom in even further onto the map itself and begin to see all the way down to the name of streets, which we think, again, could be super helpful for organizers on the ground as they try to figure out where they need to go and mobilize people for the ballot initiative, or just to do future work as they continue to do some base building. So for the key findings, again, this was already mentioned, but what we ended up finding was that there is a relationship between felony disenfranchisement, socioeconomic conditions, and a neighborhood's racial demographics, right? And so we considered or defined a neighborhood as a zip code for our work. And so what we ended up seeing was that as the number of returning citizens increased in the neighborhood, the socioeconomic conditions worsened. And as the percentage of Black people increased in the neighborhood, the number of returning citizens and dismal socioeconomic conditions increase. And so we start to see and kind of argue that Black neighborhoods are disproportionately impacted by the issue of felony disenfranchisement. And just to provide a little more background about how we got to this, we took information or data from the Census Bureau and the Florida Department of Corrections, and we looked at the years between 2012 and 2016, and looked at where individuals who were being released from prison during that time period, what zip codes they were going back to. Broward County, which is a great example of what we found in our findings or within the data. So there were over 7,000 returning citizens that we found in Broward County alone between 2012 and 2016. In Broward County, there are 52 neighborhoods or zip codes. 18% of the 7,000 returning citizens that we found were located in one neighborhood. And this neighborhood is right around Fort Lauderdale, and is also the location of Sistrunk Boulevard, which is a historic Black neighborhood. And so, again, the neighborhood is predominantly Black, over 85% of the population there. There's lower median income levels. It's $20,000 less for this neighborhood compared to the county as a whole. There are higher child poverty rates at 48% and higher unemployment rates at about 22%.
So generally, and there's plenty of more data as I mentioned, we did 10 counties, and so the report just does contain charts that reflect the data in those related to the socioeconomic factors. And so we're excited for you all to see all that data. In some ways, the data verifies, I think, what people are living and the experiences that people know, that in many Black communities, there's a confluence of challenges that people face. And I think this data really substantiates that well. And what we've done as well is really try and focus on the potential impact, right, that felony disenfranchisement has, or that the impact that reverberates throughout the community when people can't vote, because then they're excluded from decision making that affects their communities. And this is the political dynamic and the lack of political power that Judy referred to a little earlier. So that's and Dexter referred to it as well. It's efforts to confront gentrification, it's people's experiences for their children in school, it's what job opportunities are available, all of those things. And then, because people have a lot of incredible personal stories to share about it, I think part of the purpose of the report was also just to highlight that the individual personal challenges that are presented by felony disenfranchisement. So with that, we close the report with some recommendations that we hope people will consider. First and foremost, we think we need an end to felony disenfranchisement in Florida. Coupled with that, the Clemency Board rules and procedures in Florida need reform, and hopefully Amendment 4 is one step of the way in that process. There certainly needs to be a greater investment on the re-entry of returning citizens into our communities, and that includes removing roadblocks to their livelihoods. Returning citizens have incredible challenges getting jobs, getting educational opportunities, and really supporting their families. Most of this starts with, I think Dexter alluded to this, starts with harsh sentencing that's related to over-policing and over-prosecution of Black communities, and that needs to be addressed as well. Because we're talking about communities who are largely disenfranchised, there should be more significant efforts to increase civic engagement in these communities. We know that when a member of a household or when the head of a household can't vote, that has reverberating effects in their family and their community. This report focuses on the Black community particularly. There's great opportunity to diversify the study of this issue. For instance, in the Florida Department of Corrections, there needs to be another look at how we're looking at race and ethnicity so that we can really study how particular communities are affected. And then here at Advancement Project, we believe that we need to establish a fundamental right to vote by constitutional amendment so that we're not dealing with a piecemeal patchwork of protections for voting rights that has created the system where many people's rights are trampled upon. And then we've also taken a great effort to really talk about felony disenfranchisement in the context of voter suppression and in the context of a larger web of disempowerment. We are an organization that is trying to confront systemic racism, and I think you can't talk about felony disenfranchisement without talking about over-policing and over-incarceration and the attendant kind of challenges that people face in Black communities. And so we hope that this report is an opportunity to lift that up and to spark more discussion about the myriad ways in which we need to address this issue and others in the Black community. And practically, we've also created some share graphics, including the image of the systemic racism and web of disempowerment. They're social media graphics that can be used on all the standard social media platforms. And so what we hope is that all of you on the call, as well as many others, will share these out and again, spark a discussion about felony disenfranchisement and the need for rights restoration for, in Florida, 1.68 million people. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining the call. The report is available at www.advancementproject.org/democracy-disappeared. And also you can go to @ADV_project. That's our social media handle, where you can see a lot of links to the report. And there's our phone number as well. So with that, we want to open up for any questions that people have for any of the speakers or about the report.
So the first question that we got is that, will there be an update to this report in the coming months?
Great. Well, we're certainly continuing to look at the research that we collected. I think the actual production of a new report is something we're considering. But at this moment, because the focus is on Florida and on the particular ballot measure, I think our most immediate priority is to make sure this particular report gets in the hands of as many people as possible. And as I said, there is much opportunity, I think, to explore different pieces of the report and of the research that we've done. And so we'll certainly take a look at that.
So how do you suggest folks on the ground in Florida use this resource?
We hopefully would like people, well, we would like people to be as creative as they can be about sharing the materials. Certainly in this day and age, the social media toolkit that we've created, we think will be really essential. And so we'll invite organizations and individuals to tweet out about it as much as they can. We're also, there's a print version of the report, and so that will be shared with our local partners, and we'll invite people to share that broadly with their networks. And we also know that the groups that on the ground who have been doing things like voter registration and are looking towards turnout for November 6th are already sort of perusing the report and trying to think about how pieces of the data and pieces of the graphics or stories can be shared in their work. And we want to be available to be as helpful as we can in that. There's the report provides a snapshot of these 10 counties and data related to those 10 counties. But if people are looking at other counties, we invite an opportunity to talk about what other kind of analysis might be helpful.
Awesome. These are great questions. We have another one. Are you considering any legislation to help reduce some of the barriers mentioned in the report?
That's a great question, because the recommendations that we've provided, I think, require a multi-front response, and that would certainly include some kind of legislative action. Advancement Project has worked with numerous Florida partners for quite some time, and obviously we would not want to get ahead of local organizations who are doing their own work and preparing their own work, but we are here to support and explore different options. One of the things we are looking at is in the event that, or when Amendment 4 passes, how do we make sure that the right legislation or administrative steps or changes are made in order to make sure that people are able to register and vote? That was a big question, so I hope I touched on it enough.
All right, so we have another great question. Can you say more about your recommendation on diversifying data collection? Sure. So currently, it's very hard to collect data on the issue of felony disenfranchisement simply because it's not an issue that people have been really looking at for a long period of time. Secondly, the Department of Corrections doesn't really do a great job of really collecting data on this type of information, especially when we start talking about race and ethnicity. One of the hard things about that, especially when it comes to the government trying to collect data on issues around race and ethnicity, is that they don't always do a good job of defining those categories, right? And so what we often see is that one of the reasons we ended up looking specifically at Black communities was because we could easily find that within the data itself. But when it came to those who would be a part of the Latinx community, we found basically no people of that community within our data. I don't think that's because they don't exist there. I think a lot of it is due to the fact that governments don't always know how to collect that information, or they do it poorly. And so making sure that we diversify the type of data that's being collected, not just within the government, but also locally on the ground, is super important for us to better understand these issues and then come up with solutions on how to fix them.
I'd like to add to that, just with smaller communities as well. I think oftentimes you just need a larger lens or a thicker lens to actually look at the community. So if you look at the API community, which is represented in smaller numbers in some ways, you might have to take a particular approach or method to study that issue. And there isn't information collected, for instance, on the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, you know, and those communities might be particularly affected. We just don't have that information either.
Another question, what is your sense of the support and or opposition to Amendment 4?
Yeah. My sense of it, no, it's probably not accurate to say my sense of it, but I think there are polls that have been publicized about how Florida is polling at 70-some% of people supporting it. And truly in our interactions with people, when people learn of the numbers of people that are disenfranchised in Florida, and then when people hear about the process that people have to go through to try and get their rights restored, people are generally appalled. And so I would say if that's any indication, there is strong support for changing that set of circumstances. And I think that does translate into support for Amendment 4. The question I think might be about, as elections always are, about turnout. And that is both who actually gets to register and then who actually gets to the polls and is able to make their vote count once they're there.
So the next question is for you, Dexter. So how do you think this information in the report is best used in your community?
Well, I think it gives hope. Can you hear me?
Yes, if you could speak up as loud as you can, that would be great.
Okay, yes. I think it gives hope to the people in the community, because most of the guys that got into trouble in the 80s were probably in their 20s, 19, 18-year-old kids during the crack cocaine epidemic. And now these gentlemen and these women are, you know, I specifically say guys because there's a lot of men involved, but now we're 50 years old. You know, we're grandfathers, we're uncles, we have nieces, we have nephews, and people that look up to us. And you can't be a good example. I'm not saying you can't be a good example at all, but it's really hard to try to encourage others in your community and your younger generation to do better for themselves if they don't go and vote. One of the most important things is to vote. And if you can't go yourself to the polls and vote with them, then that's not good. So I think that this news is very encouraging. Amendment 4 would be great, because then you would have guys that were, you know, that lived that life, and 20 years ago, they may have been involved in criminal activities or whatever they did, but now they're business owners. They went to college, obtained degrees, and things of that nature. They're totally different people. So it's very encouraging to allow that person to become whole again and be an intricate part of his community. So the news is very exciting, and there's a lot of people that's excited. And you have that quiet group of people, the ones that are professionals that may have gotten in some type of trouble and didn't go to prison. They only got probation, and they quietly went into the courtroom because of a shoplifting charge or something that happened on their jobs where they may have been convicted of a crime or something that they didn't want anybody to know about. And they really don't want to talk about it even today because they don't want anybody to know about it. So those people are probably silently celebrating, you know, that now, hey, I can go in and have my rights restored without going through the 5-year process or putting myself out there in front of a clemency board where everyone has to write letters of support for me to show that I'm a good guy now and all of that stuff. And now all of a sudden everyone knows that I was previously convicted. Some people don't want you to know that they were convicted. Then you have other guys like me say, hey, yes, I've been to prison. You know me, I've been to prison, but I'm not ashamed of it. I'm a new person now, and now I want to move forward with my life. You know, so I think it's going to be very helpful for our community. And it's, like I said, silently, I think you have a lot of people that are rejoicing inside and praying that this thing goes through. But guys like me are dancing and saying, hey, I'm ready. You know? So that's the situation.
Cool. Great. Are there any last questions or comments from our panelists before we end? Great. I think with that, will close the call. Again, the report is available at our website. Please check us out on social media, and and please help us retweet anything that you think folks need to know about. Thank you very much, Dexter, for all the work that you do and for your participation. And we'll be around.
Yes. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Okay.
Have a good day.